watching NotesIn9.
Hello, and welcome to NotesIn9. I'm David Leedy. Episode 84, Sharing Managed Beans and XPages, Part 1. Beans can collaborate and be social too. Okay, before we get into the meat of the show and this great new contributor, I want to talk about learning Java and more about how do you learn the actual syntax of the language. I mean, and I've said before, you don't want to be afraid of Java. You've learned Lotus script, most likely. You've learned that formula language. You're probably learning JavaScript now if you don't already know it. So Java is nothing to be afraid of. It's just one more language with its own syntax and some kind of techniques that you just need to understand, and there's nothing wrong with that, and there's nothing to be afraid of. Well, how do you learn Java? How did I learn Java? Well, I went to websites. I went to, the docs, trying to look up the API docs, and don't do that. That's like eating pure pain. I got a lot of books, which some are good and some are bad. Probably the best book I've seen is the Head First Java book. That's a great book. But then, and I talked to a lot of people too who gave me a lot of individual help. But the best website for learning Java is fairly recent, and I think it's the secret weapon for learning the Java syntax, and it's called howtoprogramwithjava.com, and I have not seen anything better yet on just how to get started with the Java syntax and making it understandable to you. So this is a website done by a guy named Trevor Page, who's just a developer like I am, I think, and his contribution to his community is blogging about teaching people how to use Java and how to program with Java. And what you want to do is you want to start with his earliest posts. He's got a tutorial on there. He does a podcast also, which I haven't listened to because I don't get opportunity to listen to too many podcasts because I don't drive in my car that often. He's on Twitter, but it's really good material, and it's really well written and digestible. He also has an ebook which is very good as well, but there's a lot of good just free blog posts available on his website. So let's look at his website. So this is his website, How to Program with Java. And again, I haven't done too much with a podcast yet, but he's got a great tutorial here to start here for your first tutorial. And if we were to click on that, I have preloaded it here. He's going to go through the 5 basic concepts and what's a variable. So this is pretty basic for anybody, but just hit the next button and it just grows and stuff like that. It is well worth your time. If you go through some of his older posts, he's got nice topics on the static keyword, on Java inheritance, on how to debug, etc. Java operators. Here's an example of one of his posts. Just telling you how to use an operator. So it's really just easy to read, and it's easy to understand. Here's this ternary operator, which is a way that they do things in Java, I guess. Remainders, So you might not need a lot of this, but just it's worth going through all the posts. And here's a cool thing. He asks a lot on topics to talk about. So I know that in XPages, serialization is extremely important to us. So I asked him to talk about Java serialization, and guess what? He did. So without serialization, with serialization, he's explaining how the objects work. With a lot of good example code. So again, it's a great website. He's got a mailing list that you can sign up for when new posts come out and stuff like that. You can follow him on Twitter or on Facebook. You can subscribe to him via RSS. And to me, it's a great resource. And if you're going to get into more advanced XPages and you want to start getting into Java and stuff like that, that's a great place to start to just learn the language. Okay, now for more specific Java resources, I did a show a little while ago, which has actually been, one of my more popular ones lately. What are Java beans? In NotesIn9, episode 76. Going back in time, Jeremy Hodge came in and did 3 great episodes on an introduction to Java for XPages developers. That is still very valid material. It just didn't go as far as we needed it to go. It didn't get into serialization, which is important. It kind of ended a little early, so I'm going to kind of redo that in the future NotesIn9 episodes, and we're going to do a lot more with getting started in Java and using Java code. I know Brian Moore did some iText videos that's using iText as a Java package. So now he used SSJS, server-side JavaScript, to call that. But again, you're using these Java packages, and there's more and more blog posts available of people talking about XPages and Java. I know Pear has done some articles. I think Mikkel has done some good blog posts. So there's a lot more information out there specific to XPages. It is true you don't need to know XPages, or you don't need to know Java to do an XPage application. That still is true, but I still do believe you want to learn Java for your XPages applications. It makes some things so much easier and nicer, and it's not that hard. It's not worth being afraid of it. Okay, so now that I'm done with that little soapbox thing, I've got a great new contributor on today that I'm really excited about. I've been really kind of talking to him for a couple of years, trying to get him on, and his name is Russ Maher. And Russ is a guy out of Chicago, and he has a blog at xpagestips.com, and he is just a hugely world-class speaker and presenter and educator. His sessions rock. He's part of the XPages bootcamp team with Paul Calhoun, who again is also an excellent speaker and educator, and together they go around and do this XPages bootcamp, and they also have an XPages advanced bootcamp. I'm not sure if the URLs are different or not. I know the bootcamp is still running. I think they're doing in Chicago in a couple weeks. From at least the time that I record this podcast. So keep an eye on that website, or it's sponsored by The View. He's also on Twitter and has an email address and stuff like that. And he's a great guy, and he's done a lot of really interesting things with XPages and Java. And what he's going to do is he's going to come on today and give us a demo. This is a part one of a three-part demonstration on what he's doing with managed beans, on why he's doing it, on how they communicate, and how they can help you. So with that being said, let's go to the demo.
Hi there, my name is Russ Maher. I wanted to spend some time talking about how to share data between managed beans in your XPages applications. So we've titled this Sharing Bean Data in XPages. We've got 3 videos that are part of this. Part 1 will be the setup. In this video, I'm going to go through the setup of the application requirements that we're trying to meet. We'll walk through all of the bean code that's in there, and we'll take a look at the XML config file to see exactly how they were configured. We'll also talk a little bit about why you want to use managed beans and that kind of thing, but mostly this is going to be a code walkthrough. Parts 2 and Part 3 will actually be about the actual sharing. So in Part 2 we'll talk about sharing data between your beans using the session scope, and in Part 3 we'll talk about sharing data between your managed beans using managed properties. As far as who I am, I live outside of Chicago, and I've been a Notes Domino person ever since 1993. Myself and Paul Calhoun are the team that deliver the View magazine's XPages Bootcamp and the XPages Advanced Bootcamp. My contact information is here. If you have any questions at all regarding these slides or XPages in general, please feel free to contact me, and if I don't have the answer, I'll find somebody who does, or at least point you in the right direction. One other thing before we get to the content, there are a couple other resources on NotesIn9 that you might want to take a look at, depending on where you're at with managed beans and Java in general. If you really don't know anything at all about Java, you might want to take a look at episodes 52, 53, 54 that were done by Jeremy Hodge that are essentially introduction to Java for XPage people. So that would be a good start. If you kind of know Java a little bit already, but you don't really know your way around the very basics of managed beans, take a look at episode 76 that David Leedy put together, and he'll give you a good introduction on managed beans in general. We're going to start a little farther down the path on those concepts, but it's all the same stuff, and the code is pretty well documented. So the first thing to talk about here is, when would you even want to use managed beans? Admittedly, sometimes this is a hard sell to XPagers. They get a lot done through server-side JavaScript, and a lot of times I hear the question, from people that said, well, gosh, I can do everything I need to do with script. Why do I need to use a managed bean? Or when would I want to use a managed bean? Or why would I even want to use Java? And those are all good questions. I've come up with these 3 criteria that kind of guide me when I decide to make something into a managed bean. The first thing is complexity. if I find that I'm really getting crazy with session scope variables or view scope whatever scope variables, I've got 5 variables all managing different things within a single X page or across multiple X pages, that's a pretty good indicator to me that I'd probably be better off instantiating some sort of an object, some sort of a Java object in a bean that I could just persist throughout the whole time. The Java object is going to allow me to do a lot more than just running methods. We can describe the object a little bit better, and that'll be a little helpful. And we've actually got a situation like that in this demo. Persistence. So beans have a scope, just like other variables that can put in the scope. And if I need to persist something across the whole user session, then typically I'm going to kind of look to a managed bean to do that. Finally, performance. XPages, just by the default operation, they operate pretty doggone well. I haven't found a huge need to dive super deep into performance management when it comes to writing standard XPages, but there are some situations where if I'm thinking about it, performance is really, really paramount. Some examples would be if you've got nested repeat controls that have pretty complex controls inside of them, or if you're writing an application that's going to be used primarily over mobile devices where bandwidth is low and response time is pretty key. Those kinds of things are probably good indicators to say, hey, using Java is going to give you a little bit of a performance boost. Using managed beans is going to give you a little bit of a performance boost. Maybe those are good reasons to decide to do something with managed beans instead of using server-side JavaScript. So I would say if you had at least 2 out of these 3 requirements staring you in the face in an application, then considering using a managed bean might be a really good option. So this is an example of something that's a little bit more complex, not crazy complex, but a little bit more complex than a standard operation that we try to do in server-side JavaScript. My very first XPage application actually implemented this kind of a concept in server-side JavaScript, so I know what it takes to do it in SSJS. It's operating, works great, but if I were to redo it today, I would certainly do this in a managed bean. So here's our 2 requirements. Requirement number 1 is we've got 5 tabs: registration, history, mediation, litigation, and closure. Those tabs are only supposed to appear when the workflow step reaches the associated number. So for instance, at step 2, we want to be able to see the mediation tab, so we would see registration, history, and mediation. When the workflow step was at step 4, we would see registration, history, mediation, litigation, and closure. So basically these tabs progressively disclose or progressively appear as the record goes through the workflow. Requirement number 2 is, in addition to that, every user does not have access to all of the tabs. So in this case, I might not have access to the mediation and litigation tabs. Well, in that case, when the step is step 2, then I personally would only see registration and history. Mediation would not be visible to me. It might be visible to somebody else, but not to me. It's at step 4, then again, I would only see registration, history, and closure. I wouldn't see mediation and litigation, but somebody else logging in might too. So the combination of these 2 things basically lends itself very well to representing 2 things as objects. One concept or construct that we should probably represent as an object is a user. The user has some other information beyond just what we find in a normal old notes user kind of a context. We do have a first name and a last name and actually a full name property available on this object, but in addition to that, we've got a registration, history, mediation, litigation, and closure property, all of which will evaluate to true false to indicate whether or not this individual has the ability to see those particular tabs. And then we have an array of values that would essentially evaluate to true, true, false, 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 those kinds of things. That's going to be the representation, or one single set of representation of the true false values that this user can actually see when it comes to representing those tabs. So user object is one object. The tabs object is the object that actually represents the tabs that the user is going to see in the X page. In this case, we've got show registration, history, mediation, litigation, and closure. All those properties, again, are going to return true, false for whether or not to display those tabs. We're going to have a property for the current step. We're going to have an array describing which tabs to show in this X page, and finally we're going to have a which tabs they can see array. That which tabs they can see array is actually going to come from the user object, so we're going to communicate between those two objects. In addition to that, we've got a log object and a utilities object that we'll use in later portions of the video, and actually in parts 1 or parts 2 and parts 3. But for right now, the big ones are the user object and the tabs object. Just to highlight the bean creation steps, it's pretty straightforward. Number one, just make a Java design element, make a class in there, make a no argument constructor, set up properties in the class, and for whatever properties you want somebody outside of the class or using the class to be able to change those values or read those values, you would create getter and setter methods to do that. You want to implement serializable, which makes it a bean. Once you've got all that done, then you need to go and edit your faces config XML file in your application to identify the managed bean, which essentially means give it a name, identify the class, and then identify the scope. So it could be view scope, request scope. In our case, we're going to use session scope. Okay, let's take a look at the demo. Okay, what we have here is the user listing page, userlisting.xsp. This page is just used to create user records. There's nothing here about beans. They're just regular old X pages. Inside a user record, we would have first name, last name, and we describe their full name in a canonical format. The most important part here, though, are the tabs, the tab indicators. For each tab, we have a checkbox value, and basically I'm not allowed to see the litigation tab. And so this checkbox gets committed to a multi-valued field. When we go to use the record XSP, the bean's going to look at this record to find out which tabs I am actually allowed to see. So let's take a look at the record.xsp. So record.xsp. This is the X page that's actually using the beans, and the way you work this is you type in a step number and then click the Save and Rebuild Tabs button. What that's going to do is it's going to look at you, the user that's logged in. It's going to look at the current workflow step, and it's going to apply all of those two pieces of data to the tabs. When it refreshes the tabs panel, it's going to display the right tabs. So in this case, I'm on step 3. Registration is actually at step 0. So 0, 1, 2, and oh, whoops, 3. Well, typically litigation would show up here, but I don't have access to the litigation tab. If I go through here and change this to, let's say, step 1, save and rebuild, then again, I see step 0, step 1, but the other tabs don't appear. And finally, if we go to step 4 and rebuild, I'm going to see all the tabs except for litigation. So step 0, step 1, step 2, step 3 is litigation, and step 4 is closure. So that's how that X page works. Let's take a look at the actual X page code. Okay, let's take a look at the design of the record X page. There's a few things here that are connected to the bean and several things that aren't. So the first thing to note is this current step field is essentially just connected to the regular old document. So there's a document data source here called sales doc. This field connects to the current step field on that. The tabs each have their own visibility property. So if I open up the visibility property here, I can see that tabs bean.show registration is the value that's being computed in the visibility property. Now the tabs bean is the bean that represents the tabs, and the show registration is a property, and that value is either going to be true or false. For each one of the tabs that we have, we can actually see that there's a similar function. So tabs bean.show history. If I look at litigation and hover over this, we've got tabs bean.show litigation. So the bean is always going to return the value of that property, true or false, to determine whether or not to show those particular tabs. In the Save and Rebuild Tabs button, we actually do a little bit of code, just a regular old save the document, followed by we contact the bean again use its start tabs method, and we pass to it the unit of the current document. So what happens is the bean looks at the unit for the current document, reads the current step, looks at the user, and again computes whether or not it's supposed to show this or that tab based on who the user is and based on what step the workflow is. The last thing to identify in this X page is in the before page load event. So in the before page load event, we are also contacting the tabs bean and running a couple methods. If the document is brand new, meaning it's never been saved, we run the start tabs method and we pass in an argument, a string argument that just says new doc. The bean knows that if it gets new doc as a value, that there is no document to work with and it acts appropriately. If the document has been saved, then we pass in the unit, and again everything works just like it works inside of that button. So the workflow here is before the page loads, we run the bean decides or knows if it's or has been told if the document's brand new or not. If it's a new document, we just show the registration tab and we start the current step of the process of 0. If it's an existing document, then we pass in the value for the unit. The bean looks at the value for current step and determines which tabs to make appear. Let's take a look at the beans themselves. Now, the beans themselves are pretty straightforward. There's a little bit of code, not a crazy amount of code, but the structure is exactly the same as any other managed bean that you may have seen. The first thing is we are implementing serializable, and we have implemented just a default serial ID that is used in conjunction with serialization. We have several private values, so we've got a last name, full name, we've got a debug value in here, we've got several values for identifying true false for which tabs this user is allowed to see, and then we have an array that represents that set. Way at the bottom of this code are a whole bunch of getters and setters. So in this case I've got a setter that basically takes one input and then sets the value of the full name property to whatever has been provided. And then I've got a getter here as an example that actually reads the closure value. So notice that these are all public. They're all going to have some sort of return value, and in this case this is going to return the closure value. We have a constructor method, but it has no argument. This is an argument. Okay. This is no argument. So when we say a no argument constructor or an argumentless constructor, we just mean a constructor method that doesn't have anything in there. Doesn't mean you can't have constructor methods that do have arguments, but you have to have at least one that doesn't have an argument. We assume that the user does not have the ability to see any of the tabs other than the registration tab, so we default everything to false except for registration. And then we use the session to get a view in the database, and then we do a lookup to get that user's document. Now, these 3 lines of code all deal with sharing data between beans, and we're going to cover this in more detail in parts 2 and part 3. So for right now, we're going to leave that as says, hey, I got a document, and the document was the user's document. Once we have that document, we read the values relative to the name, and then we read the user functions field, which was a multi-valued field. That was the checkboxes, and we basically run through a little list here, and we say, hey, if it contains history, then he must be allowed to see the history tab. Mediation, litigation, closure, and all we're doing is turn the switches on to true if the field contains that value. We take those values and convert it to a Boolean array. And then finally, we have a little bit of debug code here that we use when we're going to turn on debugging. And again, we'll cover that in part 3. So that's it for the user bean. The tabs bean is very, very similar. It's serializable. It has a no argument constructor. It has a whole bunch of properties. So these properties are all, again, very similar. These will decide whether or not to show a particular tab. We need to know what step we're at. We have 2 arrays. One array is which tabs to actually show. The other array is describing which tabs the user can actually see. We actually are grabbing the user object in this bean, but again, that involves sharing. We'll cover that in parts 2 and part 3. And we've got a document and again a debug variable. And again, way at the bottom, there are getters and setters as needed. So even though we do have an argument-less constructor, it's not really doing anything, and that's just fine. Keep in mind that the first time you call your managed bean, it's going to look around and see if it's been instantiated. If it has been, then it's not going to execute the constructor method. If it hasn't been instantiated, in other words, it's never been called before, then it is going to run whatever code is in the constructor method. If you don't have any code, then really nothing will run, but it still runs the method. There's just nothing's going to happen there. We have two methods in here. We have a start tabs method that actually accepts the unit. By default, we assume that all of the tabs are supposed to be displayed, and we make an array out of those values. So at this point, they're all going to say true. We assume that the current step is at step 0. We are going to grab the user through sharing that we'll talk about later. We're going to read which tabs they can actually see, and then we're going to run this build tabs method. So the build tabs method is where all the magic happens. It takes in a string value as a unit. Now, if the string value is new doc, then as we go through here, we're not going to be able to find a document object, and it's going to fall all the way through down to this else statement, and it's going to say basically disable all those tabs. So keep in mind, we start this bean, we turn on all the tabs automatically by default. If we don't have a new document, meaning it's brand new, then really the only tab we want to see is the registration tab, and we want to disable the other ones. However, if we actually do have a document, then we've got to do some other work. So we make sure we actually have a document here. We read the current step value from that document, so it's going to be 0, 1, 2, 3, or 4. And then we loop through the array of the tabs, and we say, all right, if we're on step 2, then that means we don't want to see tabs 3 and 4. So we start one step past the current step and turn to false all the values for the remaining tabs. We have a little set switches method that we use to basically set things to false. We'll take a look at that at the end. Once we've taken a look at the tabs and we know which ones are supposed to show up based on the workflow step, then we have one more little step to do. We got to make sure that any tab that the user is not allowed to see, that we disable that tab as well. So what goes on here is we walk through all of the tabs, and for every tab that actually is set to display, if that's a value that's set to false for this particular user, then we would want to disable that tab as well. So the two steps are set the tabs to display based on the workflow step. Once you have that, then walk through the tabs again and make sure that this user has, that any tabs this user is not allowed to see get disabled. And then again, we've got some debugging code, and down here we actually have the set switches method. This just accepts an integer, and all it does is turn a tab switch to off. And so whichever integer we give it, or int value we give it, it's just going to set that value to false. The final piece of the configuration puzzle is here in the faces config XML file. The top part we'll cover later, but this part, for right now, this is the part we care about, these two bean configurations. When you configure the bean, all you have to do is give it a name. You can pick whatever name you want. You tell it what the class is. So in this case, it's com.rgmco.mwlug tabs. You can see right here, com rgmco mwlug tabs. So you have to include the full package name. You have to decide what scope it's going to be. In our case, we're going to make it be a session-based bean, or a session scope bean, which means it's going to last as long as this user is interacting with their browser. Same deal here for the user bean. The user bean we just call a user, and we identify it using this class, and it's a session scoped variable as well, or session scope bean. So that's the setup. You can download the database from NotesIn9. When we get to part 2, we'll talk about sharing the data between the beans. There's some extra bean code in there that we want to talk about. And then once we figure out how to share data back and forth between these beans on the session scope, then we'll talk about using managed properties. Thanks.
And that's the demo. I thank Russ for coming on. I'm going to get the other 2 parts out as soon as I can, and hopefully he'll come back for some other shows in the future. If you have any questions for me, here's my contact information, and I thank you for your time.